Today, this webinar is the first of the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care's interest group on employment, education, and family carers. And the focus today is on young carers. We're really delighted that this interest group has started its activities and it's tackling such an important topic. So very much a very warm welcome from the Observatory to you all. And I'll just say a few words about the Observatory and the next webinars. And I think quite a few of you know about it already, but if not, this is a platform that has emerged from a previous collaboration called GOLTC COVID. And the idea of this platform is to tackle the broader long-term care challenges internationally. So what we want to do is to support cross-national learning to improve and strengthen care systems. And we are part of the International Long-Term Care Policy Network. The goal is to identify these key shared challenges and showcase how different countries, localities are addressing them, share research evidence and facilitate collaboration. And everyone is welcome here. We're expecting that our members will include policymakers, industry advocates, care professionals, and academics, although the majority of our members for now are academics. We're 182 as of today. And what we'd like to do is to encourage to join. And I'd like to, first of all, also say a big thank you to the rest of them. My name is Adelina Comas-Herrera from the London School of Economics. And the rest of the team at GOLTC, we have Naz Zalehi, who is the person who makes everything happen. And we've also got great support from Annabelle Fenton from Research Communications, Javiera Cartagena Farias, who's marvelous at finding us interesting publications to share and also involved in interest groups. Ben Shepler has designed the website. Angie Mehta provides amazing support as well in all sorts of ways. And we also have very strong support from the director of ILPN and CPEC, José Luis Fernandez. How to engage? The first thing to do if you want to be involved is to create an expert profile. We consider anyone with experience, either lived experience, professional experience, academic experience, to be an expert on care because they have their own personal knowledge. And once you've created an expert profile, you automatically become a member. It's free to join. And then you can start to share your knowledge by sharing your interests through your bio, but also you can then you get involved if you want in joining interest groups or perhaps even suggesting to run one. We can also share your publications, and we also have a newsletter to share what we're doing. Our next webinar is going to be on Monday, and we're going to hear about long-term care policies, and we call them the three-agent tigers in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. So we will hear more also about Taiwan today, so it's wonderful to be learning more. And following that, we're going to have a look at Southern Africa. And we have a new interest group on care and social protection in Southern Africa, and their first webinar will be on social protection for older persons in South Africa. And finally, just a reminder that the ILPN that is hosting this platform has its conference in September in Bilbao. You're all very welcome. The call for abstracts and I think even registration is open now. And we hope to see many of you in person there. And that's all from me, and giving the floor to Nick.
Thank you, Adelina. I'm Nick Brimbockham, and I work at the Care Policy and Evaluation at the London School of Economics. And I'd like to welcome you all to the first webinar, the first event of the Employment, Education and Family Carers Group on behalf of myself, Stacey Agemenos, who we'll hear from later, and Jaita, who is unfortunately on leave, otherwise she'd be here today, but has helped us organise. And we're currently the steering group, although again, Stacey will talk a bit about that at the end. So the group aims to bring together people who have an interest in the topic of employment, education and family carers, and that's family carers of all ages, although we're starting with young carers. And improving support for those carers. So we're very delighted to kick off this special interest group today by looking at the situation for young carers, and we'll have presentations from Professor Xu Yang Wu from the National Chinan University in Taiwan, talking about the situation in Taiwan, and then Professor Saul Becker from Manchester Metropolitan University here in the UK, who will talk more on the international perspective. So each presenter will talk for around 15 minutes, then we'll have time for some quick questions after each, and then time at the end for a broader discussion and to hear more from you about the situation where you are, or any other points you want to bring up, which Stacey will be taking taking over to do that. So I'd like to start by introducing Professor Xu Yan Wu, who's Professor of Social Policy and Social Work at the National Chinan University in Taiwan. And I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning. Good morning to all the online friends participating in today's webinar. Hi everyone, my name is Xu Yun Wu and you can call me Jessie. I come from National Chinan University in Taiwan. Today I want to share with everyone the topic, the progress of research and welfare services for young carers in Taiwan. Today, the content I will introduce is divided into 4 main parts. The first part explains who young carers are. The second part looks at the situation of young carers from existing research in Taiwan. The third part discusses some observation related to the cultural context of Taiwan. Finally, I want to offer some suggestions on the research and service development for young carers in Taiwan. First, who are young carers? In other countries, the term young carer is sometimes used to refer to young caregivers under the age of 25. In Taiwan, young carers, also known as underage caregivers, refer to children under 18 who care for family members with disabilities, illnesses, or frailty. The forms and extent of care they are involved in vary. Besides caregiving, young carers may also take on other family responsibilities. Next, I will explain some of the situation of young carers we have observed from existing research in Taiwan. Young carers in Taiwan do not have a specific welfare status and are also a group that is easily misunderstood. The public often interpret children taking on family caregiving responsibilities from the perspective of dysfunctional family or poor parenting skills, or even from the perspective of child neglect. This is a very unfair interpretation for families with caregiving needs. Who is more likely to become a young carer? When the following 3 elements occur simultaneously, it creates a high-risk situation where children must take on family caregiving responsibilities. The first is the emergence of caregiving needs with the family. The second is when there is only one adult in the home, like in single-parent families. The third is when the family's financial situation is poor. What do young carers do? First, they provide physical and emotional care to the person being cared for. This includes intimate care, such as helping with using the toilet. Second, they act as the little housekeeper of the family. They need to organize, manage, and complete various household tasks. Third, they need to take care of siblings, especially younger siblings. So, what is the impact of being a caregiver on children? Children given family caregiving responsibilities often face multifaceted adverse effects, especially in terms of school participation and lack of educational opportunities. They also struggle with developing peer relationships and self-identity. They also find it more difficult to maintain their own mental and physical health and well-being. Why do we need to pay attention to the issue of young carers in Taiwan? In Taiwanese society, caring for family members is often regarded as virtue and that demonstrated filial piety. When individuals require assistance due to illness or disabilities, not only does society expect family members to provide care, but also the individual being cared for often hope for attention and care from their family. Additionally, under the reports and packaging by Taiwanese media, young carers are often portrayed as understanding, hardworking, never complaining, and selflessly dedicated positive role models. Their contributions are closely linked to familial duties. As a result, their efforts are rarely appropriately acknowledged. Next, I would like to talk about how birth order and gender affect young carers in the cultural context of Taiwan, as well as how young carers make decisions about their future. In a qualitative research study, it was pointed out that in Taiwanese society, there is a tendency to view the eldest son or daughter as the representative or head of the family. Therefore, when a family has caregiving needs, the eldest son or daughter is more likely to become or be chosen as the primary caregiver. But there is also a very special phenomenon that occurs when the eldest one is in the stage of pursuing their education, or when they need to take on the family's financial responsibilities. The second eldest child steps in to take over or fill the caregiving role. This is related to the role expectation assigned to children at different stages of their development. Next, I will explain the gender phenomena among young carers. Under the concept of family responsibilities, girls are more likely to be chosen as caregivers compared to boys. Quantitative study on young carers indicates that female respondents make up 62.6%, while male respondents account for 37.4%. Girls significantly outnumber boys. Another small-scale survey of indigenous young carers in Taiwan indicates that girls have a significantly higher workload in caregiving than boys. Regarding the future choices for young carers, there are also some unique findings. Western literature indicates that young carers tend to choose certain helping professions, such as social workers or medical staff. A qualitative research study in Taiwan found that young carers rarely mention wanting to enter helping professions. Instead, they consistently express a desire to get into military or police academies. This is because if they are able to attend military or police academies, they do not have to pay tuition and also receive a certain amount of monthly allowance. This provides them with financial security and job assurance for their future. In this way, their ill parents can feel more at ease. Lastly, I would like to offer some suggestions for future research and service development related to young carers in Taiwan. First, we do not know the number of young carers. Therefore, a general survey should be conducted. It is suggested that the survey could start from schools. Second, the needs of young carers and their families should be assessed. Which services and support should be prioritized for development also need to be evaluated. For example, addressing young carers' stress responses, discussing the redistribution of roles within family, or developing service program that has centered around the family as a whole. Third, after service intervention, continuously assess whether there has been a change in the situation of young carers and their families. This is necessary to understand the effectiveness of the service provided. Lastly, I look forward to paying more attention to gender issues within the group of young carers. That concludes my sharing. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to receiving your feedback. For the upcoming discussion, I will invite a translator, Chin Yi, to assist me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. Thank you very much for kind of explaining that. And yeah, it's interesting to see the differences as well as the similarities. If anyone's got any questions, either raise your hand, your electronic hands, you could put something in the chat. So who would like to start? Madeline, I can see, oh, yours, Saul. Actually, you better raise your electronic hands because it's quite difficult to see on my screen. So did you have your hand up there, Saul?
I did. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you go first.
Thank you. So Jessie, thank you so much for that. And a lot of the things I'll be talking about in a moment will continue many of those themes. Whilst you said that you didn't have the numbers of young carers in Taiwan, that you hadn't done that, I just wondered whether you had any sense of the proportions of children. So not a figure of numbers, but do you think it's very small in Taiwan, or do you think it's more significant? I'll be telling the proportions of children in other countries in a few minutes, but I wondered if you had any indication at all about the extent of caring amongst the child population.
秦怡，我有听懂他的，然后我会说明，然后你帮我翻译好吗？你可不可以帮我先说明一下？
So I think that Professor Jessie will first do some of the deliberations, and I think I will do the translation later. So please, Professor Wu.
我对于台湾有多少数量的这个年轻照顾者，其实我预计它可能跟西方的这个年轻照顾者的那个 percentage 差不多，大概是3%到4%左右。那不过呢，我很期待就是我们可以从学校端开始做调查，因为我们台湾同学的那个中辍率非常的低，所以大部分的儿少其实都待在学校里面。如果我们可以从学校来调查的话，其实数量会比较精确一点。
Okay, so I'm trying to translate it, the Mandarin one to the English version. So I think that Professor Wu mentioned that while we are not sure about the exact amount of the percentage of the young carers in Taiwan, Professor Wu believes that the number is close and similar to the Western countries. It's around that 3% to 4% of the young care percentage. And that she also mentioned that because we are actually now advocating for doing more survey on the numbers of the young carers in Taiwanese societies, and it will be a good idea that we do the surveys from the system of the school and the education, because that I think that compared to other Western countries, that actually we have kind of like a low rate of quitting the schools from for example, from the elementary school students or the junior high school students. So it would be great if we can do the survey from the system of the schools. So I think that we really highly anticipate our future research on that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Madeline.
Hi, I'm Madeline. I work with Nick at CPEC at LSE. Thank you. That was really, really interesting, especially about the interests of young carers for their future careers. That's really interesting. I missed the beginning, so I'm sorry if you said something about this. I was in another meeting. I was wondering you said about assessments and that more work needed to be done in assessments. So I was wondering, If you want to say a bit more about that, what needs to be done. And I was thinking in relation to that about how young carers are picked up and whether the presence of young carers is picked up in adult services or not.
请你帮我翻译，我先回答一下哈，就是说，其实因为我们针对这个年轻照顾者的服务其实还很少，那大部分都是跟着就是成人照顾者，所以他们可能会有一些喘息服务，那或者是说有一些以家庭为中心的，比方说。就是说去讨论家庭里面的角色重分配，所以我觉得这一些喘息服务跟这一些就是以家庭为中心的这一些家庭角色的重分配需要被评估。不过就是说也很谢谢他的问题哈，就是我们现在确实没有特别针对年轻照顾者有额外的其他的服务，所以其实这些评估比较是说未来当我们有服务的时候我们可以做的事情。
I believe that Professor Wu really highly supports to the assessment of the needs of the young carers. But unfortunately, now in Taiwan, we have to say that there are not too much of the services related to young carers' needs. And so from now, some of the services that could be given to the young carers are similar to the services that we given to the adult care, such as some of the respite care services. But unfortunately, we have to say that we don't have too much special designed services, especially for young carers. And so based on the assessment, also, Professor Wu also believes that in the future, the assessments have to be highly connected with the services that will be designed in the future. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I'm from the University of Plymouth. My question was really just an extension to that. So what's the age range that you are seeing with the young carers that you do know about? And with assessments, what kind of age range are you anticipating to identify?
秦怡他是在问说，我希望能够针对什么年龄层的孩子吗？
Yes, I believe is it.
好，那我回应一下哈，就是说，目前我们就是比较针对的是未满18岁的孩子。那因为在台湾有一个法律是《儿少权益保障法》，它是针对未满18岁的孩子。所以，如果我们首先针对这群孩子的话，他们可以在这个法底下得到更多的保障跟权益的发展。那不过呢，未来我还是希望，就是说，我们对于年轻照顾者的关注可以扩大到就是年轻的成人照顾者，因为我们现在有很多的孩子其实18岁之后到22岁之间是上大学的。那我们也知道，就是说家庭照顾责任会影响到他们对于就是高等教育 higher education 的参与。所以虽然我们先是倡导就是关注18岁以下孩子，但是未来希望也能够提升年龄层到年轻的成人照顾者。
So for your questions, according to the age range of the anticipated survey in the future, that Professor Wu mentioned that actually Taiwan now has a law of, I believe it's the Child Rights Protection Law. And so she believes that based on this law, maybe so for the first version of the Young Carer Survey, we can do some of the survey within the age range under 18 years old. That is the definitions of the young carers of Taiwan right now. But actually, Professor Wu has a higher ideal goal that actually we know that the children after the young adults after 18, for example, between 18 or 25, these kind of populations like go to college or universities who receiving higher educations. She believes that these populations also are facing some of the caring burdens while having their education and having their family caregivers roles as well. So based on these kind of needs, it is also necessary that we do further research between these age range in the future. But because that, just as I mentioned before, that because we really do have not any like surveys or services, I believe that actually the young carers topic is not as solid and sophisticated as the UK is. So I believe that for the first step, the survey will be anticipating to do under the age of 20 and under the age of 18. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up, and we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So I'm very pleased to now hand over to Professor Saul Becker, who's Pro Vice Chancellor at the Faculty of Health and Education at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. So over to you, Saul.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. And much of what I'm about to say carries on from what Professor Jessie also said. Forgive me, but there are no PowerPoint slides, so it's just me, I'm afraid, that you have to listen to, but it'd be good to open up for conversation. So let me start at the beginning, really. In 1992, over 30 years ago, I did my first piece of research on young carers called Children Who Care Inside the World of Young Carers. And at that time in the United Kingdom, there was no understanding really of who young carers were and what they did. There was very little research. There was very little public or professional awareness of this particular group of children, and there was certainly no specific legal rights or entitlements for children who were carers. So in fact, in that period, in the 1990s, young carers were very hidden, very ignored. And over the last 30 years or so, we have seen great progress in the United Kingdom. And many of you will know that the UK now has a significant number of services for young carers. You can do what I call the taxi driver test. A good indication of whether a country is aware of young carers is to do the taxi driver test, which is to, when you're in your local taxi, you ask your taxi driver, do they know what a young carer is, or whatever it might be called in your own particular country. And you will find that 30 odd years ago, no one understood or knew what a young carer is, but now certainly in the United Kingdom, and taxi drivers are usually very clever in the United Kingdom, they know what a young carer is. And that's a good barometer of the state of public awareness about young carers. But effectively in the UK now, we have hundreds of young carers projects, most of which are provided by the NGO sector, charitable and voluntary organisations. We have widespread public awareness. We have particular codes of guidance and practice for social workers, for teachers, for healthcare professionals. Young carers have specific legal rights in the United Kingdom for assessments of their needs and their ability to continue to care. And we have lots of different pieces of research and literature about how you should intervene with young carers. So having said all of that, though, the reality in the UK is, even though our responses are advanced, and I'll come back to that in a moment, we still only reach the tip of the iceberg in terms of the numbers of young carers. So we have a good patchwork quilt of services, recognition, research and interventions, but even so, we only do, as I say, meet the needs of a small proportion, maybe 1 in 5 or even less, of all the young carers. In 2016 and again in 2021, a colleague and I, Professor Agnes Liu and I, devised a classification to classify different country responses to young carers. And our classification looked at whether a country had specific legal rights for young carers, or whether young carers' needs could be met through general child welfare legislation. We looked at the volume and quality of the research that was coming out from a particular country. We looked at the infrastructure of services and responses and support to young carers in a particular country. And we were able then to start to classify different country responses to the issue and the needs of young carers. So, for example, on that classification, given what Professor Jessie has just said, Taiwan would be classified as an emerging country in that it has some research, but not extensive research. It has no specific legal rights for young carers, and it needs to do some big surveys to determine what proportion of children are carers and so on. So Taiwan on that classification would be seen as emerging, as would many other countries in the world. And then at the other layer of the classification, you have countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, some of the Scandinavian countries, and so on, where there is greater recognition of young carers, where there is greater research, where young carers have specific legal rights, or if they're not called young carers, but are called children who are next of kin or whatever, there is a close approximation to being a young carer. So you have this sort of classification which shows different country responses. But even though the UK is an advanced response, because we've been working on this for well over 30 years now, it doesn't mean that it's a perfect response. As I've indicated, we only do support a small proportion of the numbers of young carers who we believe are out there. So what do we know from 30 years of research in the United Kingdom and in other countries? And and it's fair to say that if you looked at Google Scholar, 20, 30 years ago, you would have found very few publications on young carers. But today, you will find at least 250,000 publications or items on Google Scholar that relate to young carers. Many of those will be research, but other things will be there from reports from different countries, etc., etc. So there has been a significant acceleration in our knowledge and understanding of who young carers are and what they do, based on research from around the world and including emerging countries who are now starting to research. But it would also be fair to say that on the Becker and Liu classification, the vast majority of countries in the world still have no response whatsoever to young carers. So if you're on the classification, you're doing something. And but for probably 90% of countries in the world, there is no response whatsoever that we know of. What do we know from research? Well, I think we know what and who young carers are. I think we know that different methodologies produce different numbers of young carers. So, general census type surveys produce in the United Kingdom a proportion of between 2 and 3% of all children would be young carers from a general survey of a whole population. But when you ask children directly, you find that that proportion is much higher, and that will be an issue for how you go about that in Taiwan. So, for instance, the figures that we report are usually around 10% of all children are young carers in the United Kingdom. Becca Lacey and others who are on this call have produced recent longitudinal data, which indicates the proportion is between 9 and 12%. I had a PhD student who 20 years ago did her PhD, which said it would be 12%. So, these are the kinds of figures that we're approximating around, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But different methodologies produce different numbers. We know from the research around the world that mental illness, disability, long-term illness, substance misuse, comorbidity are very common amongst the care receivers, and those care receivers are usually parents, siblings, grandparents, particularly in Italy and some other Southern European countries, and of course, friends as well. We know that many young carers are very young, from the age of 5 upwards, and many are providing over 10 or over 20 hours of care per week. And we know from Becca Lacey and other people's work in this room today that that had got worse under COVID, with more children providing care, providing longer hours and feeling more isolated and desperate. We know the kinds of caring tasks that children do: intimate and personal care, as Professor Jessie said, general and nursing care, emotional care and support and supervision, household management, sibling care, and one of the things that is increasingly becoming clear is self-care, the care of themselves in the absence of other people who might be able to provide that because of limited capacity. And we know that the outcomes for children of caring can be both positive and negative. The literature has talked in the past very much about the negative outcomes on children's psychosocial development, on their own mental health, their own physical health if they're lifting and carrying people. That we know that they have difficulties in transitions to college, higher education, and to paid work, and to adult independence. And again, longitudinal studies are really beginning to help us understand the career, if you like, of a child who is a carer, not just going through childhood, but then into adulthood and the longer term consequences. So how many young carers are there in different populations? Well, in the UK, as I've said, according to the census, it will be between 2 to 3%. But according to surveys of children directly, it's anywhere from 10 to 20%. In Norway, we know the proportion is approximately 6%, in Australia, 4%, in Sweden, 7%, in Canada, anything between 12 and 27%, depending on how you measure this. Italy, 7%, Switzerland, 8 to 10%, Germany, approximately 6%, Austria, 4%, Japan, 4 to 6%, and the Netherlands 10%. So what we're talking about now are significant proportions of the child population, and that varies from country to country, depending on the welfare system or welfare state that's in existence. It depends on the role of the family and how the family is regarded. It depends on the availability of direct services for children and so on. We also know from 30 years of research why children become carers, and certainly issues of low income and poverty are key, as Professor Jessie said. We know that the illness or disability is what we call the trigger that leads to a child having to provide care. But we also know that the intergenerational contract that exists, an unwritten intergenerational contract, particularly in some sub-Saharan African and other countries, is about providing care to your family members, your parents, grandparents, and so on, just as they have provided care to you during your childhood. So there is an issue of reciprocity that cuts through all of these things. We know that in many families, there is no alternative. They can't go to the market to buy an alternative form of care, long-term care or intervention, healthcare, social care. So because of these factors and culture, birth order, gender, being socialized into a caregiving role, love, affection, attachment, co-location, living with the person that you're looking after, these are the things that explain why some children become carers in families, whereas other children don't. And it's not always in the UK and other countries that it's the oldest child. Sometimes it's the younger child. Sometimes it's a middle child. And it really does depend on each family. We also know about what I call a continuum of children's caregiving, that most children, all children, we would want them to care about family members and strangers. We want children to be brought up in an environment, in families where they care about others. But the difficulty is that with young carers, they move from caring about other family members to caring for those family members and friends, taking on increasingly high levels of responsibility. It takes longer and longer throughout their childhood. The tasks become more complicated, more complex, more intimate, and so on. And so children get drawn into these caring roles. And in bringing this sort of to a close now, because of the time, I think that we're also very clear in those countries that have started to really develop their awareness and services for young carers, that our primary task is to move children who are young carers from a position of what we call vulnerability, which means inappropriate care or excessive care, the restricted education that many experience, their reduced life chances into adulthood, shown by the longitudinal and other surveys, their affected health and well-being. We want to move them from a position where those characteristics are common to a position of growth, where they learn, where they thrive, where they achieve, where they feel protected from unduly heavy caring responsibilities, where they can enjoy, where they can feel supported, identified, assessed, and ultimately where they can flourish. And many of the services that take place in the UK and others are an attempt to move people from vulnerability to growth. But the big challenge, I feel, and this is my final comment, the big challenge for young carers services in the UK and in many other countries is, what is the purpose of a young carers service? What is it that we are trying to achieve? And I would put it to you that there are a number of conflicting models that we now need to really start to think through. And it may well be that people in the room today have views on this. Are we trying to prevent children from being young carers in the first place? Is our aim to prevent, a preventative approach to stopping children becoming young carers, particularly very young children from the age of 5, 6, and 7, where if we don't intervene early, these caring roles will become institutionalized within their families. And as those children get older and older, the expectation on them to provide care will become greater and greater. Is our task then to prevent children from being carers? Or is our task to reduce the amount of caring that children have to perform within their families? Is it that the caring is too much? Is it that the caring is too difficult, inappropriate for their age, for their maturity, for their level of competencies, etc., etc.? Do we expect a child of 12 to do more complicated things than a child of 7? And what about a child who's now 17? So I think what we need to ask ourselves is our purpose to reduce the amount of caring within families? And if so, what is it that we are trying to reduce? The tasks that are most difficult, the tasks that are most embarrassing, the tasks that lead to greater tiredness or exhaustion, the specific tasks which restrict children from going to school or being on time, and so on. Or is our task to intervene to help children better adjust to their caring roles and their life career opportunities? So should we be trying to help them adjust to being a carer, but also to getting to school, to having good health and well-being? You know, is our role to assist them to navigate through the worlds of caring and the worlds of childhood? Or is our task to lead to a better care-life balance for these children? So for me, the issue is one of what is the outcome, or what are the outcomes that we are trying to deliver from the services and interventions that are being developed around the world? Are they about preventing children from becoming carers? Are they about reducing the amount of care or specific types of care that children perform? Is it about intervening to give children a better adjustment to their caring roles and their childhood experiences, a better care-life balance, helping them adjust, and so on? I don't believe that at this stage we are in a position to be very clear about what are the purposes of the interventions that are developing. And I would put it to us all that perhaps is the next big conversation that will be had or should be had in the young carers world about the purpose of our interventions, because each of those things that I've spoken about require different ways of working. They require other people to provide particular types of support and so on. So the big question is, What can we do for young carers that will make the real difference for their lives during childhood and beyond? Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you very much. So that was really, really interesting. Lots there to think about. It's interesting about the different rates in different countries and, of course, all the questions you posed at the end.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And thanks a million for, first of all, 2 amazing presentations and for the opportunity also to be involved in the work of this interest group. Thanks a million, Saul, for a great transition, I think, to the discussion session of this webinar this morning with your amazing list of questions. I myself could now speak for 2 hours because I have many comments and questions as well, but I see some of you already have raised their hands, and so I'll pass the floor straight away. Participant now, John.
Hi, yes, my name's John Bangs. I am an independent carers policy advisor, so I used to work in local government as a carers lead, and I now work on young carers issues as a campaigner, I suppose, and lobbyist. My question, Saul, I mean, we know so much more about young carers than we did 30 years ago, in no small part thanks to your good self. But one thing that strikes me is that we perhaps know less about the very youngest carers that you spoke about, because much of what we know has been derived from young carers themselves. You mentioned that you get a far higher number of young carers when you actually ask children if they're caring. And we know that those census figures are just total underestimate. I mean, like in Kingston upon Thames, where I live in southwest London, they are working with 2.7 times as many young carers as exist according to the census, which seems to me very clever of them. Much of what we know about the impact on young carers' lives is what they've told us. A lot of it through interviews with researchers like yourself, but also where they've had a voice through young carers forums facilitated by carers charities. But one thing that strikes me, though, is that the ability of little children, 5 and 6 year olds, 7-year-olds, to engage with that process, to speak to and articulate their own needs, is much less than that of older young carers. And there's a significant risk that when listening to the voices of young carers, that we miss the voices of those little ones. And yet quite a lot of carers start caring when they are very young, and when we don't pick up on them until they're older. And I wonder what your thoughts are. How, I mean, I noticed even quite a lot of there's quite a thing going on at the moment that talking to adolescent young carers, and I can't help but feeling that that's partly because they're easier to contact and talk to than little ones. But what are your thoughts about how we might address that? Because I think we're missing something here.
So thanks, John, for the question. I think you're right that we know less about children who are carers from the age of 5, say, to 10 or 11, which is the primary school age in the United Kingdom. There are a number of studies that I think are being conducted now to focus much more. Qualitative studies have generally indicated the kinds of experiences of very young children. The census, the United Kingdom census, showed that when you look at the 3 last national census, 2001, 11 and 21, that one of the biggest areas of growth in the numbers of young carers was in the youngest age group, 5 to 7. So we've seen significant growth in that age group, according to parents themselves who complete the census. But you're absolutely right that we need more dedicated studies of young carers of primary school age to see what their particular experiences are. And that would require, to some extent, a different use of research methods, because we would need to use more participatory child-friendly methods, you can't ask some of the large survey type questions to very young children because their level of understanding and experience is different. So there are methods that you researchers can use to hear the voices and understand the experiences of young children. And many of the people in this room today are experts in those methods. So you're absolutely right to point this out as an issue for further and more detailed research. The reason why some people have been focusing more on adolescents is that because we become increasingly interested in policy terms about the so-called transition that children have between childhood and adulthood. So that age group of adolescent young carers is 15 to 17. And there was a big study that Stacey and others in this room have been involved in, the Me-We project, which was conducted in 6 European countries involving 2,100 adolescent young carers. And that we were really interested in that because of their experiences of mental health, their own mental health difficulties, which become much easier to understand and to measure with those kind of older children who are carers than, say, a 5 or 6 year old. And we can see then the transitions. I'm hoping that people like Becca, who's on the call today, and others who at the LSE and others who are doing this longitudinal work using different large-scale surveys and samples will be able to tell us more about those the experiences of those younger children and how that affects them into adulthood in due course as those longitudinal studies become more mature.
Thank you, Saul. Andy?
Brilliant. Thanks, Stacey. Thanks, everyone. For people who don't know me, I'm Andy McGowan. I'm the Policy and Practice Manager at Carers Trust, so I lead on their UK policy work relating to young carers. I just wanted to follow up, Sol, with a comment rather than the question, but I think the other thing that will help us to understand the experiences of the young carers will be over time the school census. Because I think for those of you who aren't aware, schools in England are required to complete a census return every year, and last year, for the first time, young carers were added to it. So what that does mean is we already know, so the figures came out yesterday, what issues such as attendance look like for young carers, both for secondary, but also for primary school. That data is going to need to improve over years because only 78% of schools didn't record any young carers. But what it means is we can start to see, in terms of what their attendance looks like, and we are already starting to see that actually some of the attendance issues are more coming up in secondary school than primary school, but you can also see other areas such as lateness, exclusions. So it starts to give you another data source to start to understand what's happening for these particular young people. How does it compare both to older young carers, but then also to other pupils of primary age as well. So I think over time, that's really going to sort of help the narrative around this age group.
Thank you, Andy. Becca?
Thanks. I have a few little bits and bobs, but following on from that discussion, actually, Andy, I think I agree with you about the school census data, but I feel like it's going to be a really long time until that data is like truly reflective of the number of young carers in society, because it relies so much on like them being known to school and the person then who completes the form reporting that. So it's so many sort of steps down the line, but absolutely it's a step in the right direction. I agree. One thing that I completely agree about the youngest carers, because actually this is where we're really lacking data, specifically in the UK. So I use Understanding Society a lot, and that goes down to age 10, and the question's quite rubbish, but it's something. But we can't actually go any younger than that in a lot of the longitudinal studies that we have. I mean, there is going to be an opportunity very, very soon, and I'm really like already on it. So the MRC are about to fund a very large study called the Adolescent Health Study, which will be of 8 to 18-year-olds followed up for 10 years. And we're really advocating for some care questions to go in from that, because that would give us from 8 years and then 10 years follow up. So that'd be a fantastic data resource. But I was just thinking maybe an easy win at the moment is actually, because we do have all these really great longitudinal studies, not only in the UK, but in other countries, maybe a really good starting point would just be to get like a retrospective question put into the surveys that exist. So something like how Understanding Society or the Millennium Cohort Study or any of those, to say, you know, the sort of general question that we get about kind of caring responsibilities, but then to ask a follow-on question, say, on how long have you been doing that for? Because that might just be a helpful thing that we could do quite easily, like in the meantime, until we can get these sort of bigger studies of the youngest age groups. I think it also helps with people kind of evaluating, you know, how long they've been doing things. And so I agree, it's totally easiest to ask to a teenager those sorts of things, isn't it? But it might be a starting point.
Thank you, Becca. Coming back to you, Joe.
My question was sort of around what you're touching on about what we're trying to aim for with this research. And I wondered, it sounds like within different countries around the world, the research and the interventions are almost at different levels. And so I wondered whether there was sort of any merit to thinking about aims in a quite context-specific way. So, for example, within the UK, whilst there's still a lot of progress that could be made, there are young carers who are going on to transition to university. And so we might want to look at the outcomes for them when that is happening. Whereas it sounds like in other contexts, young carers don't necessarily always have the support to even get to that stage. So are the aims for this research and the aims for interventions, do they need to be, as I say, sort of quite context specific and kind of taking into account all of the other challenges that a young person within that nation or community might face?
So thanks, Joe. Really interesting question. I think that what you find is that because different countries are at different stages in their awareness and responses, the research that is conducted in a country reflects a particular moment in time. So where a country is just emerging, they generally want to know how many young carers there are and what proportion of children are carers. As a country becomes more established in terms of thinking about and responding to young carers, they start to ask some of the kinds of questions and do some of the kinds of things that we've been talking about. They become much more interested in maybe doing a specific piece of work or work around very young carers or children who are caring for parents who misuse alcohol or drugs, etc., or children who are caring for parents or grandparents, and so on. So different countries have different research agendas, and that's dependent also on what phase or stage they are in becoming aware about young carers. So we do know that there are country nuances. So, and this is all from published research over the last 10 years, really. I think one of the best and the greatest advances in the whole world of young carers is cross-national and international studies. For me, that's the really interesting developments where more and more countries are doing specific pieces of work. So, for example, we know that in Italy, from the Me-We project, which was looking at these 2,100 adolescent young carers, that adolescent young carers in Italy are much more likely to be looking after grandparents than young carers of the same age in the United Kingdom and in other countries. So there are different country nuances, and in each country there will be a need to be specific and particular about the responses. If a country does not have a social security system, for example, or there isn't free secondary school education, as in some countries in the global south, let's say, then what you do for young carers will need to be different from what you do in very advanced countries. But then you have countries like the United States, which is potentially or presumably one of the most advanced countries in the world, which has virtually no recognition whatsoever of young carers and has only one young carers project in Boca Raton in Florida. So you get sort of it's an inconsistent profile, but there are country variations which are really important in terms of the research agendas, but also what young carers will need, A, from the state, and B, from the third sector, NGO sector, in terms of support, as well as what they might expect from their own families in support through an intergenerational contract with the extended family itself.
Thank you. So, Andy, I'll come back to you in a second, but if I may, a very quick comment from my side. And I suppose by way of introduction, I'll say a few words about my organization. So we are based in Brussels. We are the European umbrella organization representing all family carers, but we of course do focus on young carers as well. Our job in a way is twofold in the sense that we are involved in research, but our job ultimately is to translate research into policy recommendations. So, you know, building on the discussion so far, my main comment would be to say, when thinking research, you know, please bear in mind how your research can potentially contribute to changing the mindset among policymakers. Just to illustrate this, you know, the MeWe project that Saul, you know, briefly mentioned earlier, which was the very first EU-funded study on young carers. The reason why we got the funding is that we put the focus on the impact of of caregiving on young carers' access to education and employment. So the, productivity factor, the economic argument, that's ultimately what draws the attention of policymakers. So just a quick comment, a quick message to all of you, majority of you are researchers, I think. Bear that in mind when, defining your research questions and so on. So just a quick comment in passing, that would certainly facilitate our work here at EU level as well. Thank you. Andy, back to you now.
Thanks, Stacey. Saul, I'm interested in your perspective. I think in the UK, we've got to a position now where identification of young carers is most commonly within education, children's social care. So we're obviously in the UK now focusing on how can we get earlier identification through adult social care, health, etc. For those countries where the notion of young carers and identifying is in the developing stage, where do you think it's going to need to be the focus in terms of around that initial identification? Is it going to be through education, and that's people themselves, or actually is it going to stand more chance through sort of healthcare settings who might be working with a person? Yeah, I'm just interested as to actually your perspective now compared to obviously when you first started the research 30 years ago, which is probably a very different approach.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. A really good question. So when I first started researching, the first study took us a year to do, and it took us a year almost to find 12 young carers to interview, and very quick to analyze the data and write it up, because it was just so hard in those days to find young carers. But if I was starting again now, I would certainly be going through schools on the basis that unless the country hasn't got free education, schools are in principle supposed to be a universal service. So I would be surveying within schools and educational establishments to try and identify young carers and to try and understand their needs. But I don't think it's a matter of one or the other, Andy. I would be doing surveys in schools. I'd be doing qualitative studies in schools. I'd be doing them in primary schools as well as secondary schools, so that we can get at the very young carers. I'd be doing surveys within general practice, help doctors, to try and see whether we can understand how many young carers are on the patient list or would be would be using doctors' surgeries, because that would be another source. I'd be doing them studies in hospitals. They shouldn't be alternatives. They should all be complementary, and all of those different data sources should feed together to give us a sophisticated profile of the numbers, but also the experiences and the outcomes of caring on children. But if I was to start somewhere in an emerging country, I would start with education establishments and schools.
Thank you. So, Jessie?
好，秦怡，再请你帮我翻译一下。我想要说的是，因为刚刚大家有讨论到研究，那在我2009年那个时候呢，我刚得到博士学位，一小段时间，那我是因为看了 Saul Baker 的那个发表之后，然后呢，我又想到台湾有一个很特别的奖，叫做总统教育奖，都在奖励这一些年轻照顾者。 好，那所以我就思考到说，其实我们是否应该用奖励的方式来回应这些孩子，还是我们应该要多做一些什么？所以我就从一些质性的研究开始。不过质性研究做了几个比较了解，就是说young carer 是什么，他们在做些什么之后，还有跟国外的比较之后，其实渐渐的就会没有办法满足在接下来的研究阶段，所以还是会想要知道有多少这样的孩子，我们才能够开始去设计服务。
Okay, so I believe that Jessie want to make add some comments on the topic we discussed. That actually, she mentioned that in 2009, when Jackie just received her PhD degree in the UK, that she actually in that time she read a lot of the articles and research from Becker, and it gives her an inspiration of that we should do more research on the young carers research in Taiwan. And actually, she wants to mention that we have a kind of like a President Education Award was given annually to the young carers that kind of like to saying that they are acting good as a young being a caregiver, and this is kind of the cultural things that in the Asian country, that in Taiwan, for example. So, but I think that these situations actually gives Jessie an inspiration that we should do more qualitative research on the young carers topics. But following years, I think that although Dr. Wu did a lot of the qualitative research on the issue, she realized that actually now we need more data and more quantitative database evidence on this kind of population. So this is the kind of like the obstacles and also next steps in the future of the young carer research in Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you. I must say it's always extremely fascinating in these international exchanges to see not only how the cultural, differences drive the prevalence of informal care, but also shape the responses. There's a lot more to unpack very clearly from the discussion, and we're almost reaching, unfortunately, the end of this webinar. So I'm sure there's going to be follow-up webinars on the topic, given the interest. Before we conclude, and with the permission of my colleagues, I'll share a couple of pieces of information regarding future events, including the next webinar of this interest group. Before I do that, I'd like to thank again very warmly our two presenters this morning. Professor Becker and Professor Wu, and also Chin Yi for the translation. Thanks a million. So the two pieces of information I wanted to share with you. The first one, so the next webinar of this interest group is planned for mid-June. In principle, we will focus on older carers this time. So very clearly from our discussion this morning, we heard that young carers are invisible. We've made some progress in recent years with family carers generally, but the measures that have been put in place tend to focus primarily on working carers. But then obviously there's still, a huge group of older informal carers or family carers who also deserve attention. So the next webinar will explore the specific situation and needs of those older carers and potential solutions to address these needs. So that's for mid-June, so stay tuned. By the way, we are always open to ideas you may have about future topics to be explored. So you can contact the Secretariat for that. The second thing I wanted to share is the fact that from the 9th to the 11th of April, we will be lucky to co-organize or co-host rather the 4th International Young Carers Conference in Manchester with Manchester Metropolitan University. I know that many of you will be there, so it's going to be great to see many of you in the flesh in Manchester. Now, I'm afraid registrations are closed at this stage, but we will, of course, communicate around the event. So again, pay attention to the social media. relay the message we will convey, because it's going to be important to, create a momentum around the conference. So once again, thanks a million for your very active contributions this morning. Thank you to my colleagues for, I think, a very successful webinar. And with this, I wish you all a great weekend. Thank you.